There is a substance most people over 40 consume several times a week. It is sold in every grocery store, celebrated at every dinner table, prescribed informally as a reward for surviving a hard day. And it is quietly accelerating the aging of every major system inside your body. Not in the way cigarettes did, not dramatically, not obviously, slowly, invisibly, at the cellular level, in the tissue, in the hormones, in the brain. Alcohol and aging are not a neutral combination. After 40, your engine has changed. The enzymes are slower. The filtration system is under different pressure. The hormonal firmware is already running a critical update. The brain's overnight repair window is narrower than it has ever been, and alcohol interferes with all of it, simultaneously, every time. Most people have never been given the complete picture of what this means for the decades ahead. This video is that picture. Not to shame you, not to hand you a rule. To give you information that is accurate, complete, and yours to do something with. Stay with me. Let's begin where alcohol always begins. The liver. In the engine model, the liver is the primary filtration system. It clears metabolic debris, it processes fuel byproducts, it regulates blood sugar, it metabolizes hormones, it maintains the internal environment clean enough for every other component to function. It is not a passive organ. It is one of the most metabolically active structures in the body. And the moment alcohol enters your bloodstream, the liver receives a priority override. Everything else stops. Fat oxidation pauses, estrogen clearance slows, glucose regulation shifts, protein synthesis takes a back seat. The filtration system drops every active process and dedicates its full capacity to one urgent task: breaking down ethanol before it reaches critical tissue. This is not detoxification in the gentle sense. This is an emergency protocol. And like all emergency protocols, it was designed to run occasionally, not daily. At 25, the liver executes that protocol and resets within hours. By morning, the engine is clean. At 45, the reset takes measurably longer. The primary enzymes responsible for metabolizing alcohol, alcohol dehydrogenase and aldehyde dehydrogenase, decline in both quantity and efficiency with age. This is not a lifestyle variable. It is a biological reality documented consistently across decades of hepatology research. The problem is not the ethanol itself. It is the intermediate compound the liver produces while breaking it down: acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is classified as a probable human carcinogen. It binds to proteins, it fragments DNA strands, it triggers inflammatory responses in surrounding liver tissue. And in a filtration system running slower clearance cycles, it does not pass through quickly. It lingers for hours. In contact with tissue that is already slower to repair than it was a decade ago. Now add the second layer, the one most people never connect to their drinking. When the liver is repeatedly rerouted to process ethanol, the job of oxidizing fat, of actually burning stored fat as fuel through a process called beta oxidation, gets chronically suspended. The fat that was moving through the fuel system gets stored instead, and the liver becomes one of its primary storage sites. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease was once considered a condition of heavy drinkers only. That definition has been substantially revised. Current research now recognizes that consistent moderate alcohol intake in midlife adults, the kind most people would describe as completely normal social drinking, contributes to hepatic fat accumulation in ways that were systematically underestimated for years. A fatty liver is not a neutral liver. It is a compromised filtration system. And a compromised filtration system means everything downstream runs dirtier. Hormones, metabolic output, inflammatory baseline, immune response. Think of it this way. You would not expect a clogged oil filter to protect a high-performance engine. You would not keep driving and assume the engine was fine. But that is precisely what most people over 40 are doing. running the same input through a filtration system that is no longer processing it at the speed it once did, and attributing the consequences to something else entirely. The practical signal is already in your daily experience. Morning recovery that stretches past noon, sleep that feels heavy but not restoring, abdominal weight that resists everything you try, digestion that has become progressively unpredictable. These are not random symptoms of getting older. These are readings from a filtration system under chronic, repetitive overload. And if the filter is already strained, what happens to the hormonal firmware running on top of it becomes significantly more consequential. That is where we go next. If the liver is the filtration system, hormones are the firmware, the invisible operating system that runs everything. Temperature regulation, energy allocation, fat storage decisions, sleep architecture, cognitive clarity, muscle maintenance, sexual function, mood stability, hunger signaling. You do not feel your hormones directly. You feel their output. The energy you have in the morning, the mental clarity at noon, the ability to recover from stress, the quality of sleep, the way your body responds to food and exercise. After 40, that firmware is running a significant update. For women, estrogen and progesterone are shifting in a pattern that is nonlinear, sensitive, and deeply affected by the internal environment. For men, testosterone is declining at a rate of roughly 1% per year after 30, with the curve steepening in the mid-40s. These are transitions, not failures. But like any critical firmware update, they require a stable, low-noise environment to run correctly. Alcohol creates noise, directly, at the hormonal level. Here is the mechanism that most people over 40 have never been told. The liver does not only process ethanol, it also metabolizes and clears hormones from circulation. Estrogen in particular is packaged and eliminated by the liver through a process that requires enzymatic capacity and bile clearance. When the liver is occupied with ethanol, estrogen clearance slows. Circulating estrogen stays elevated longer than it should. In women navigating perimenopause, this amplifies an environment that is already hormonally unstable. More bloating, heavier mood disruption, breast tissue sensitivity, sleep that becomes even less predictable. The symptoms that were already difficult to manage get louder. In men, estrogen accumulation shifts the testosterone to estrogen ratio, and that shift accelerates precisely the symptoms they are most quietly afraid of. More visceral fat around the abdomen, less lean muscle, reduced drive, persistent fatigue, a cognitive flatness that feels like it arrived gradually and never quite left. Recent studies in endocrinology have confirmed a direct dose-dependent relationship between alcohol consumption and estrogen dysregulation in both sexes after the age of 40. The more frequently alcohol is consumed, the more sustained the disruption. But estrogen is only part of the firmware being corrupted. Now, let's talk about cortisol. Cortisol is the stress signal. In the engine model, it is the temperature gauge that rises when the system is under load. Short, purposeful bursts of cortisol are normal, necessary. The problem is chronic elevation. Alcohol triggers a cortisol spike. Not during the drink, after it. The cortisol response typically peaks 3 to 4 hours after the last drink, which means the glass of wine you had at 9 in the evening is generating a measurable stress hormone surge at 1 in the morning, while your body is supposed to be in deep repair. For a 40-plus body whose adrenal system is already managing a higher baseline load, that 1 in the morning surge is not a minor inconvenience. It fragments sleep at its deepest phase. It elevates inflammatory signaling during the window that was meant for tissue repair. And it actively suppresses the very hormone the body most needs to protect, testosterone. High cortisol and adequate testosterone do not coexist well. The body treats them as competing priorities. When the stress signal is elevated, testosterone synthesis is deprioritized. This happens through 2 simultaneous pathways. First, ethanol directly impairs the Leydig cells, responsible for producing testosterone. Second, the cortisol surge we just described further suppresses its output. The result is a body that wakes up with lower testosterone, elevated inflammatory markers, disrupted sleep architecture, and accumulated estrogen it did not fully clear. And it wakes up this way, not after a bender, after an ordinary Tuesday night. The firmware update is trying to run. Alcohol keeps closing the process before it completes. The practical observation here is direct. Track 2 weeks. Mark your sleep depth, morning energy, midday clarity, and afternoon cravings on drinking nights versus non-drinking nights. Do not interpret, just observe. The data your body generates is more honest than the social narrative around what a glass of wine does. And what we look at next moves into the component that makes all of this matter most, the one that determines the quality of every single year ahead of you, the one with no replacement part. The brain consumes 20% of your total energy output.
It accounts for 2% of your body weight. That ratio alone tells you everything about how seriously the body treats this organ. It is the most protected, most prioritized, most metabolically expensive component in the entire engine. And it is the one that, when compromised, changes not just how you feel, it changes who you are, how you think, how you remember, how you relate to the people you love, how you make the decisions that determine the shape of the next 20 years. Alcohol crosses the blood-brain barrier within minutes of consumption. It suppresses glutamate, the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. It amplifies GABA, the primary inhibitory signal. The effect is immediate and unmistakable. The noise turns down, the tension loosens, the social friction dissolves. That part is real. But here is what is also real in a brain that is no longer 30. After 40, the brain is navigating a different neurological terrain. Cerebral blood flow begins to decline gradually.
White matter integrity, the insulation around nerve fibers that conduct signals between brain regions, shows measurable changes visible on MRI imaging. Neuroinflammation, the low-grade immune activation inside brain tissue itself, becomes more persistent and harder to resolve. The brain is running on longer repair cycles, with less tolerance for additional disruption. And alcohol disrupts the one window those repair cycles depend on most: sleep. More specifically, a phase of sleep that most people do not think about until they lose it: REM sleep. REM is where the brain consolidates memory, processes emotional information, integrates the day's experiences into long-term storage, and it activates a mechanism that, until about 15 years ago, science did not know existed: the glymphatic system. During deep sleep, cerebrospinal fluid pulses rhythmically through microscopic channels that open specifically during this phase. It flows through brain tissue and physically flushes out metabolic waste, protein debris, inflammatory compounds, the exact compounds, beta amyloid and tau proteins, that accumulate in the brain tissue of people with cognitive decline and neurodegenerative disease. The brain does not just rest at night, it cleans itself, and alcohol closes the drain. Even 1 to 2 drinks measurably suppresses REM architecture. The brain cycles through the motions of sleep without fully completing the maintenance protocol. You spend 8 hours unconscious and wake up feeling like the system never reset, because it did not. Researchers publishing in nature-based neuroscience journals have now documented something that deserves to be said out loud more often. Consistent, moderate alcohol consumption, not heavy drinking, not binge drinking, the kind most people over 40 would describe as completely unremarkable, is associated with measurable reductions in brain volume over time. The prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the regions responsible for decision-making, emotional regulation, and the consolidation of long-term memory. The shrinkage is not catastrophic. It is gradual, consistent, and cumulative across years. Here is what that looks like from the inside. The fog that sits behind your eyes by mid-morning, the word that was right there and then was not. The decision fatigue that arrives earlier in the day than it used to. The emotional reactivity that you did not have in your 30s. The sense that the clarity you used to take for granted now requires effort to access. These are not simply signs of aging. They are readings from a control center being denied its nightly maintenance window, repeatedly, over time. One skipped cycle is recoverable. The brain adapts, it compensates. But 1,000 skipped cycles across 3 or 4 years of consistent drinking do not simply reset with a good week of sleep. The deficit accumulates in ways that eventually show up on imaging.
In cognitive testing, in daily function, the people who arrive at 65 with genuine mental sharpness, reliable recall, and emotional stability are not uniformly blessed by genetics. More often than not, they are people who protected the overnight repair window, consistently, across the decades that preceded the ones where it matters most. And what connects the liver, the hormones, and the brain into a single systemic pattern is the mechanism we examine next. It runs underneath all of them. It is the reason they tend to arrive together. Before we get into the biology, I want to ask you something. Think about the last morning after you had a few drinks. Not a hangover, not nausea or a pounding head, something quieter than that. The face that looked slightly puffier in the mirror than the night before. The fingers that felt a little thicker. The gut that was off in a way that was hard to name. The lower back that ached without a clear reason. The mood that was flatter. The patience that was thinner before 10 in the morning. Most people dismiss this as dehydration, or poor sleep, or just what being in your 40s feels like now. But there is a more precise name for what you were experiencing. Your immune system was activated. Not because of an infection, not because of an injury, because something inside your body signaled a threat, and the immune system did exactly what it is designed to do. It responded. That response is called systemic inflammation, and after 40, it is one of the central drivers of every condition on the list of things you most want to avoid. Cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cognitive decline, neurodegenerative disease, cancer risk, accelerated cellular aging. Alcohol is one of the most reliable ways to keep that response chronically activated, and it starts in a place most people would never think to look: the gut. When alcohol enters the digestive system, it does not simply pass through on its way to the liver. It interacts directly with the tight junctions between the cells lining the intestinal wall. These junctions are the body's border control. They decide, at the molecular level, what enters the bloodstream and what stays contained. Alcohol loosens them, not in a way you can feel in real time, silently, consistently, every time. Researchers call this increased intestinal permeability. The practical consequence is that bacterial byproducts meant to remain inside the gut begin crossing into the bloodstream. One compound in particular, called lipopolysaccharide, or LPS, is a potent immune activator. LPS in the bloodstream does not read as a minor disturbance, it reads as an invasion. The immune system deploys inflammatory cytokines, C-reactive protein rises, interleukin-6 climbs, tumor necrosis factor activates. These are not obscure markers on an academic chart. They are the precise signals that precede, accompany, and accelerate every chronic disease most people over 40 are quietly trying to prevent. And here is the detail that changes the weight of this information entirely. This is not the biology of heavy drinking. This is the biology of consistent, moderate, socially unremarkable alcohol intake in a midlife body with a gut barrier that is already more permeable than it was a decade ago. The gut lining changes with age, independently of alcohol. The microbiome shifts, the tight junctions become less robust. The barrier integrity that was once taken for granted requires more support to maintain. Add alcohol on top of that aging gut barrier, and you are not adding a small amount of additional stress to a system with ample reserve capacity.
You are adding repeated, reliable disruption to a barrier that is already at its functional threshold. Now consider what this means for the entire engine.
Chronic low-grade inflammation in the cardiovascular system contributes to endothelial dysfunction. Arterial walls lose their smooth, flexible quality. Plaque forms more readily. Blood pressure becomes harder to regulate. The cardiovascular system, which was already adapting to the changes of midlife, is now managing an additional inflammatory load it was never designed to carry indefinitely. In the brain, neuroinflammation overlaps directly with the cognitive changes we discussed earlier. An inflamed brain consolidates memory less reliably. It processes emotion with less precision. It makes decisions with less clarity. The fog is not metaphorical, it is biochemical. In the abdomen, visceral fat, the layer most resistant to conventional diet and exercise efforts after 40, is itself an active producer of inflammatory cytokines. It is not just stored energy, it is an endocrine organ that amplifies the inflammatory signal the gut has already started. The loop becomes self-sustaining.
Alcohol increases gut permeability. Permeability increases systemic inflammation. Inflammation drives visceral fat accumulation. Visceral fat increases inflammatory output, which makes the system more sensitive to the next inflammatory input, including alcohol. The engine runs hotter, on a fuel it cannot process efficiently, and the temperature keeps climbing by degrees so small that most people mistake the heat for the normal temperature of midlife. It is not. The practical signal is one you have probably already felt. The recovery that takes longer than it should. The belly that arrived quietly and refuses to leave regardless of what you try. The joint stiffness that seems disproportionate to your activity level. The skin that looks slightly more inflamed than it did 5 years ago. These are temperature readings. Your body has been displaying them for a while. What we look at next is the deepest layer of all of this. The level where the rust is not measured in organs or hormones, but in the cells themselves, in the biological clock that determines how fast you are aging at the most fundamental level possible. Step back with me for a moment. We have been looking at individual components, the liver, the hormonal system, the brain, the gut and its inflammatory cascade, each one significant on its own, each one connected to the others in ways that most medical conversations never quite assemble in one place. But here is what the picture looks like when you see it whole. When you drink regularly after 40, the liver is running an emergency filtration protocol it was designed to use occasionally. Acetaldehyde is lingering in tissue. Estrogen is accumulating in the bloodstream. Fat is being stored where it should be burned. The filter is falling progressively behind. At the same time, the hormonal firmware is saturated with interference. Estrogen elevated, testosterone suppressed. Cortisol spiking at 1 in the morning, during the window that was allocated to repair. The operating system that was trying to run a critical midlife recalibration is executing it in an environment full of signals it cannot resolve. While all of this is happening, the brain is being denied its most essential maintenance cycle. The glymphatic flush is incomplete. REM architecture is fragmented. The control center is running today on yesterday's unfinished data. And over months and years, the tissue itself shows the cumulative effect of those missed cycles. The gut barrier is loosened. The immune system is partially activated around the clock. Inflammatory cytokines are circulating in the cardiovascular system, in the brain tissue, in the adipose layer. The engine is running hot in every compartment simultaneously. And at the cellular level, oxidative stress is accumulating faster than the body's antioxidant systems can neutralize it. Mitochondria are producing less energy and more metabolic waste. The internal biological clock, measured in part by the length of telomeres at the ends of chromosomes, is advancing faster than the calendar suggests it should. This is not one problem with one solution. This is a system under coordinated chronic stress.
degrading slowly enough to be mistaken for normal aging, moving quietly enough that most people spend years attributing the symptoms to the wrong causes. The stubborn abdominal weight is not purely a calorie problem. It is a metabolic and inflammatory consequence of a system under repeated biochemical stress. The fragmented sleep is not purely a stress problem. It is a direct neurochemical consequence of a substance that suppresses the one sleep phase responsible for the brain's self-cleaning mechanism. The cognitive fog is not simply the natural cost of getting older.
It is the accumulated deficit of a control center that has been denied complete overnight maintenance across hundreds of consecutive nights. The hormonal symptoms that feel untreatable are not exclusively a function of age. They are being amplified by an interference signal that the body cannot resolve while the input continues. Same glass, different engine. Fundamentally different maintenance bill. And here is what the research offers that is worth holding carefully. The aging body retains genuine adaptive capacity when the inputs change. Liver fat begins to decrease within weeks of significantly reduced alcohol intake. C-reactive protein and other inflammatory markers drop measurably within a month in many midlife adults. Sleep architecture begins to restore. Hormonal rhythms become less disrupted. Cognitive clarity, reported subjectively and confirmed in multiple studies, begins to return within 2 to 4 weeks. The engine does not repair overnight, but it repairs. This is the information most people over 40 were never given in one clear, complete place. Not because the science was unclear, because the conversation around alcohol in our culture carries so much social weight, so much identity, so much ritual, that the biology gets quietly set to the side. This video sets it back. Not with judgment, not with a prescription, with the complete picture. Because you cannot make an informed decision about a machine you only partially understand. Let me be direct with you for a moment. Everything in this video is information. Information about mechanisms, about biology, about what happens inside a specific type of body at a specific stage of life when exposed to a specific input repeatedly over time. None of it is a verdict. None of it is a rule. But here is what I have observed consistently in the conversations that surround this topic. Most people over 40 are not making uninformed choices about alcohol. They are making choices based on a version of the information that is incomplete. The social version, the cultural version, the version that has been normalized so thoroughly and for so long that questioning it feels almost eccentric. This video is the rest of the information. What you do with it is entirely yours. But if this conversation landed for you, if something in the past hour confirmed what your body has been trying to say in the only language it has, which is sensation, then I want you to know that this is what this channel is built for. The human engine is not a wellness channel. It is not a place where we trade in motivation or simplify complexity into steps and slogans. It is a place where the body is treated as what it actually is, a high-performance machine operating in the specific biological conditions of midlife, requiring intelligent, precise, evidence-informed maintenance. Every video here is built on that foundation. Sleep architecture after 40.
Hormonal recalibration, metabolic engineering, cardiovascular resilience, cognitive longevity. The real science of what changes in the body after 40 and what the evidence actually says about what you can do about it. If that is the conversation you want to be part of, subscribe and stay close. This is the place where people who have stopped accepting vague answers come to find precise ones. Now, let's bring everything in this video to its final point. Because understanding the mechanism is one thing, but there is a question underneath all of this that matters more than any single mechanism we discussed today. And it is the question the final block of this video is built around. Not what alcohol does to the body after 40, but what you want your body to be able to do
In 10 years, in 20, on the days that matter most, that is where we finish. We started with a familiar ritual, the end-of-day drink, the social glass. The reward the culture has been normalizing since before most of us were old enough to participate in it. And we followed that ritual all the way down, into the liver, running a protocol it was designed for emergencies, into the hormonal firmware saturated with interference at 1 a.m, into the brain, denied the one nightly process responsible for clearing the debris that accumulates between every version of who you were yesterday and who you need to be tomorrow. Into the gut, loosened and leaking, quietly activating an immune system that was never meant to run without rest. This is not a story about drinking too much. This is a story about a changed engine being given an unchanged input, and the cost of that mismatch being distributed quietly, invisibly, across the tissue and cells of a body that is too busy compensating to announce what it is losing. Most people over 40 do not feel their biological age increasing. They feel the symptoms of it, the fog, the belly. The sleep that never quite restores, the energy that must be coaxed out rather than trusted to arrive, the body that used to absorb and adapt and now simply absorbs. These are not signs that you are failing. They are signals from an engine communicating through the only channel it has. You were not given a broken engine. You were given one that crossed a threshold after 40, where the tolerances shifted, where the repair timelines lengthened, where the margins for certain inputs narrowed, where precision began to matter in ways that convenience had previously been able to override. That is not a loss. It is a specification change. And the engineers who understand the new specification are the ones who protect the decades ahead. The rust that accumulates is not inevitable. It is the residue of maintenance decisions made with incomplete information. Now you have the complete information. If this video gave you something real, share it. Send it to at least 5 people in your life who are over 40 and still running yesterday's protocol through today's engine. They need this conversation as much as you did. Leave a comment and tell me what landed for you, or tell me what system you want to look at next. The video I am building after this one goes into sleep architecture after 40, specifically what happens to the aging brain when the overnight repair cycle is chronically cut short, and what the evidence says about restoring it with precision rather than guesswork. Subscribe if you want to be there for that conversation. This engine is worth the maintenance. Until next time, keep optimizing.